This is a video about a guy called Dashkovskij who did a critique of the economist Rubin back in the 1920s. Now you may wonder why it's relevant. Well, there was a debate going on in those days between Rubin and other economists, and whilst Rubin has been translated into English and widely read in the West, his opponents haven't been, and Dashkovskij was one of his main opponents. Rubin provides the basis for what's known as the new reading of Marx, promoted by authors like Heinrich, Postoni, Reuten, Arthur, etc. So Dashkovskij is worth reading to understand the fundamental weakness of these people, the latter people. Alan Cottrell and I came across an old microfilm that I thought was of Dashkovskij in the journal Under the Banner of Marxism, back in the dating from the mid-1920s, in the Soviet Studies Library in Glasgow. Talking to Alan yesterday, he said he wasn't sure if that one was actually Dashkovskij or one of the other authors. Alan reads Russian, which I don't. Then, a week or two ago, the German translator of Towards a New Socialism sent me links to English and German translations of Dashkovskij. When I looked at them, I found that Dashkovskij's arguments were essentially the same as the ones that I'd independently arrived at and presented in How the World Works, the book How the World Works. If you're interested in it, this is where the Dashkovskij text can be found now. His critique of Rubin centered on Rubin's interpretation of value theory and argued that Rubin overemphasized the social aspect of value whilst neglecting its material and technical foundations. He said that Rubin's approach was overly philosophical and detached from concrete economic realities, leading to idealist distortions. And he accused Rubin of reducing value just to a social relation and ignoring the role of production processes and physical labour expenditure in his interpretation of value. Now, Dashkovskij cites extensively from Capital, and this is his starting point, where Marx says, on the one hand, all labour is physiologically an expenditure of human labour power, and its character of identical or abstract human labour, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labour is expenditure of human labour power in a special form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of useful labour, it produces use values. Dashkovskij argues that Rubin and Rubin followers seek to revise this definition of abstract labour by claiming it only addresses physiologically defined labour, applicable to all economies. The Rubin school insists that Marxist economic categories, including abstract labour, must be both social and historical. Dashkovskij examines this and starts off from what is meant by a historical perspective. He stresses that all historical epochs share a fundamental basis: material production and reproduction. He cites Marx in his famous letter to Kugelmann, who noted that the distribution of labour has to follow natural laws, although these are shaped by social forms. And political economy studies these forms, particularly the exchanges between matter between man and nature. And these are required for an understanding of universal economic principles. Marx's works the outline, which Dashkovskij relies on quite a lot, and capital, analyse supra-historical elements like labour and production that transcend any single system, forming the foundation of both capitalist and non-capitalist economies. Now, economic categories are historically grounded, but they're not limited to that. The term historical in Marx has a precise meaning, which is often misunderstood. For instance, in his outline, he notes that general production traits are abstract, transcending any single historical era. Yet, grasping any individual mode of production requires you to see how these universal elements take unique forms. For example, if we strip capitalism of wages and surplus value, strip capitalism from wages and surplus value, we see core features that are shared across capitalism and feudalism: necessary labour and surplus labour. These categories apply to feudalism and slavery. And recognising these fundamentals is essential because essence and appearance diverge. If you rest at the level of appearances, you can't see the similarities between capitalist and feudal economies. Dashkovskij argues that abstract labour is a general concept and applies to labour as physiological activity. It applies fully only in specific circumstances. He says when no single form of labour dominates and when individuals can easily shift between different types of labour. That is to say, if the overwhelming majority of the population is doing the same thing, peasant agriculture, abstract labour has a limited relevance. It's the ability to shift between activities that gives it relevance. This allows labour to become a general means of generating wealth rather than being tied to specific individuals or specific forms, as it would be in the caste system that Marx refers to. This is very much the same explanation that I give in How the World Works. How I put it was that societies distribute their members into different social roles and divide up their working time between activities. Some activities, like feeding and dressing oneself, are purely personal. Some, like childcare, family cooking, farming or industry, benefit other people. And different kinds of activities produce their own useful effects: sex, babies, baking bread, bricklaying walls, etc. For each effect, we have to carry out a particular sequence of bodily movements that interact with the environment, implements and people. And these are the concrete aspects of labour. This is what concrete labour is. But at the same time, from the standpoint of society as a whole, each activity has another more abstract role, since each is part of the division of labour. The bodies and time of its members are society's fundamental resource. They're both limited. There are only a given number of people alive, and on any given day, there are only 24 hours. And for some of these hours, people must be asleep. And the social division of labour has to partition the available time of all these people between the tasks that are required. And what's being divided up here are millions of person hours that go to make up the social working day. And this aspect of being part of the social working day is the abstract aspect of social activity. Activity is part of the social organism. Abstract labour is fully developed with commodity production, but pertains in other epochs as expenditure of human energy in an indifferent form always occurs, and Marx's definition allows for this broader interpretation, unlike Rubin's definition. In the shift from commodity production to socialist production, Dashkovskij asks, will abstract labour disappear? No, he says. Analysing Marx's conditions for abstract labour, they're not abolished under socialism, but they become further developed. He says there's no specific dominant type of labour. There's easy transferability from one type of labour to another. There is the loss of the connection between the labour process and determined individuals. That is, people will have greater ability to move between and into trades and professions. Greater social mobility. All this occurs under socialism to a greater degree than under commodity production. Capitalist techniques, he says, have already made the specific content of labour largely irrelevant, as automation increasingly replaces human labour and human labour becomes more and more the superintendence of machinery, and this trend intensifies under socialism. Therefore, the economic relations that still to an extent separate abstract from concrete labour under capitalism, the obstacles that exist to moving into professions like medicine, these things will tend to wither away. In any organised economy, labour is inherently social. In commodity production, labour becomes social by transforming the product into the money equivalent of the abstract labour done. But this doesn't mean the concept of abstract labour is unnecessary in other modes of production. All calculation requires accounting units. Marx, when talking about commodity fascism, says that mystifications come from the rarefied expression of abstract labour, not the transition from concrete to abstract labour. He emphasises that neither concrete labour nor abstract labour is in itself in any way mystical. He says, in all states of society, the labour time that it costs to produce the means of subsistence must necessarily be an object of interest to mankind, though not of equal interest in different stages of development. And lastly, from the moment that men in any way work for one another, their labour assumes a social form. So social labour and the abstract amount of labour required to produce the means of subsistence are always there. Compulsory labour is just as properly measured in time as commodity producing labour. Every serf knows that what he expends in the service of his lord is a definite quantity of his own personal labour. The serf had to give a certain number of days a week to the lord. By being measured in time, this was a relation based on abstract labour. The lord could set the serf to do whatever concrete tasks he wanted during the 2 days a week that the serf had to work for the lord. Here's what Marx says applying to socialist production. After the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, but still retaining social production, the determination of value continues to prevail, in the sense that the regulation of labour time and the distribution of social labour among the various production groups, ultimately the bookkeeping encompassing all this, becomes more essential than ever. Now, this is obviously quite different from what the Rubin school say. They say abstract labour will disappear when commodity production is abolished, and there will be no calculation of value. Directly contradicting what Marx says there. What they do is they are confusing the measure with what is being measured. A scale like this, rather obsolete type of scale, measures abstract mass. it can measure a mass of flour. But the mass of flour is not created by the act of measuring it. Measuring reveals something that was there already. Use another machine, a cash register, to measure the sold value of the flour. And the sale of the flour measures its abstract labour content. But the abstract labour content is not created by the sale, is not created by pulling the handle of the cash register. End.